Schiller's Aesthetic Education of Man, which is a 27-part series of letters where he actually defines an idea of how you can actually, achieve political freedom. That there's a relationship between political freedom and individual freedom, and that the means of achieving that is the ennoblement of the character of the individual in society. And then there's an important role of art and beauty, so we'll talk a bit about that. But first I want to talk about the Schiller Institute and the origins of the Schiller Institute. And this woman should look familiar. This is Helga Zeppler-Rusch, who's the founder and the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, which was created in 1984 in Germany and in Washington, D.C. And the initial motivation for Helga's creation of the Schiller Institute was, at that time, again, this is the 1980s, it was to improve the relationship between the United States and Western Germany. Now, think about what was happening at that time. We were in the midst of the Cold War. We still had the United States, NATO, the Western Bloc. You had the Soviet Bloc. And at that time, what was going on was the buildup of what they call intermediate and short-range nuclear missiles on either side, on the NATO side as well as on the Warsaw Pact side. And you can see some of this portrayed in the political cartoons and media articles. This was something that was on everybody's minds. You had a lot of street demonstrations, and particularly in Germany, because they were right smack dab in the middle of all of it. In fact, that picture of that street demonstration is from Germany. So this actually created a lot of tensions, not just between the Soviets and the US and NATO and the Warsaw Pact, but also within the alliances. It created very big tensions between Germany, West Germany, and the United States. So Helga had this idea that we have to do something to improve that. And I'm not going to get into the SDI. That's a different subject. Not different, but it's related, obviously, but I'm not going to get into that side of it. Her idea was that what we need to do is take the best tradition of each nation and, in a sense, offer that to the other nation. And Helga's idea was that the United States, our best tradition is reflected in our accomplishments in statecraft. Particularly, you have the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. That these are the greatest documents in statecraft in human history. And they resulted in the culmination of a long process that does extend from Europe, which became the founding of the US Republic. And we have had some of the greatest statesmen in human history, from Benjamin Franklin to Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King. So that was her idea as far as what the best tradition coming out of the United States was. From Germany, you have the German classics. You have some of the greatest scientific thinkers, poets, philosophers. You have people like Nicholas of Cusa, Johannes Kepler, great scientific thinker, Leibniz, Mendelssohn, Bach. There's a long list of great German classical thinkers, but there is this rich German classical tradition which Friedrich Schiller is also a part of. And that could become the basis for elevating the relations, which at that time were really, really eroded. So there were dozens of conferences. There were participants from various countries, not just the US and West Germany. And one of the things that happened was a lot of the participants, particularly not just from the underdeveloped nations, but from all over the world, would bring to the conferences various development programs. In fact, there were development programs for practically every part of the planet, every continent. So that was, and because of that kind of development, the idea was to expand the mission of the Schiller Institute, to not just deal with the US-German relationship, but to elevate the relationship of the nations within Europe, but also between the developed and the underdeveloped nations. And so that culminated in the future of this, well, this is like, I guess you can say, I don't want to say seed crystal, but this would later develop into what we think of today as the Eurasian land bridge, world land bridge idea. But the focus of the Schiller Institute is around the areas of culture, science, economics, history, and the idea is that is to promote the conception of man as a Promethean being, or as expressed in Christianity, man in the image of the Creator. That's the notion of mankind that we want to promote, and that has to be the notion that is central to statecraft and how we approach relations with other nations. So we organized conferences promoting development. We also did a lot of work around music, particularly around promoting not just classical music, but we had a very, really a potent campaign around reviving the Verdi tuning. It was an international campaign that attracted a lot of support from a lot of leading opera singers and musicians to lower the tuning of instruments to be in accord with the natural registrations of the human singing voice. So we had all kinds of conferences, musical events, classical concerts, things of that nature. And so this went on for, several decades, 3 decades. Let's move up to 2012, because in the post 9/11 era, what we've seen, particularly out of the U.S., and Europe's gone along with it, is the radical shift in foreign policy towards regime change, imperial wars, interventionist warfare, in the name of spreading democracy and freedom, and all of these things. And at the end of 2011, you had the murder of Muammar Gaddafi, which happened in the midst of the toppling of the Libyan government under Barack Obama. And when that happened, Lyndon LaRouche put out a statement saying that this is actually going to escalate very quickly to thermonuclear war. That Gaddafi was murdered so that the British Empire and their friends like Obama could move on to Syria. And so you had the whole Arab Spring, which is really, it wasn't a revolution as people might think it was. It was part of a broader policy of spreading chaos, civilizational disorder, and confronting Russia and China. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the following year, organized the first of a series of conferences entitled "The New Paradigm for the Survival of Civilization." And again, this is the first in a series of conferences to promote the idea of a new, just economic system for the world, based upon new principles. And the necessity of this was the fact that the transatlantic paradigm was dying. It was in a total state of breakdown, total state of collapse. You actually, in parallel, had the emergence of China as an economic power, and in the following year, the Chinese government under Xi Jinping made official the policy of the One Belt, One Road, that their official policy would be to promote economic development under what they call win-win cooperation with other nations. So they would be exporting development. You also have the following year the BRICS Summit, which is all parallel to what our organization has been campaigning for, which is to reorganize the relations of nations around what Helga LaRouche calls the common aims of mankind. This notion that the interests of nations are by nature in opposition is fraudulent. But that is the basis of the geopolitical system, is that nations inherently will be at war, and we reject those ideas, and we are of the view that nations can have a harmony of interests. So, again, the first conference was in Frankfurt. We call them the New Paradigm Conferences. We've had a number of other conferences since then. We actually set up a new website, which is an archive for these conferences, so you can watch all of the presentations. We had various speakers from various organizations, agencies from all over the world. We've also revived classical courses. This was initiated in New York City, where we revived the Schiller Institute New York City Community Course, which again was started in Manhattan. And since then we set one up in Brooklyn, in Queens, and in Houston, Texas, Boston. We actually have one in Seattle and the San Francisco Bay Area. And we also do a lot of music work in Germany, and it's going to spread. But this is actually crucial to the political work and to our organizing around a new economic system. So what's the significance of Friedrich Schiller? Why do we have to study Schiller? Why are his ideas important? I mean, who is this guy? I think the best way to get a sense of who he is to study his ideas, but you also get a sense of who he is by the difficulties he had in the course of his life. Because this man was really, he was truly a revolutionary figure. He's perhaps the most endeared philosophical figure, poet, dramatist from Germany, or from that region. But he also made a lot of trouble for himself. That's one way to put it. He was not, a lot of the ideas in his dramas and his essays and his writings espoused the Republican ideals that were made real through the American Revolution. And his idea was that Europe could repeat the process of the American Revolution, and we could actually establish republics in Europe. And he was very bold about this, so much so that he often had to flee because the ruling oligarchs were not very happy with some of the content of his writings. There were attempts to censure him. He was arrested at certain points, so he had to move around because he wanted to keep writing. And actually, even after his death, around 1819, his works were banned by the Carlsbad Decrees, which was an oligarchic reaction to the threat of the spread of Republican ideals to Europe. So he lived a very controversial life, and his ideas were controversial after his death, but they were also very celebrated. In fact, Schiller's ideas, as well as a lot of the German classical ideas, at one time were an intricate part of American culture. There used to be celebrations of Friedrich Schiller's works in the United States. I don't know if that exists in Canada. But I can say that even to this day, if you go to New York, to Central Park, if you go to Cleveland, Ohio, if you go to Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, you will see statues of Friedrich Schiller. So again, that was the 19th century, which would be the height of I would say, the US celebration of the German classics. The 20th century, well, that's been a different story. It's been a disaster. There's been a willful intent to destroy that connection, which, again, that's a subject in and of itself. We'll touch upon that a little bit. But, so Schiller's idea, well, Schiller was addressing the idea of political freedom. And as I said at the beginning, political freedom has to be reconciled with freedom of the individual. I think there's often this notion that individual freedom and political freedom are irreconcilable. Like today you have this idea of often the conservative notion is limited government. You want the government to do as little as possible because that gets in the way of your freedom. You have those kinds of ideas. But Schiller's view was that the improvement of the politics of a state has to happen through the ennobling of the character of the individual. So that's his idea. He also had this very famous saying, a great moment has found the little people. And that saying was his response to the French Revolution, which was a failure. The French were not able to consolidate the Republic. The United States was. There were hopes that the French could do it. You know, you did have people like Lafayette. You did have collaborators with the revolutionaries in the US, but why did the French fail? So, you know, Schiller grappled with that question. And so this idea of the ennoblement of the character is crucial because what he was seeing was a twofold problem. One is you had the masses of the French people. That the general condition of the masses of the French people was that they had their impulses, but their impulses were not reasonable. The other side of it was the nobility. That the nobility, they were cultured, they were educated, they were enlightened. However, they did not actually have empathy for the people they ruled over. And in fact, in Schiller's view, that's a worse state. And so he's thinking that the comment, these are two sides of one problem. And so we'll get back to that. Because what you have, whether it's the masses of the French people or the nobilities, is you would have imperfect characters. So if you're going to achieve an improvement in the political state, how do you actually achieve the perfection of the human character? Now, most of Schiller's contemporaries, whether it's Rousseau or Kant, they actually had this idea of the two states of man. You have the animal state of man, which is associated with our feelings, our senses. You have mankind in the sense world, and then you have what's called the rational side of man. And that these two aspects of the individual are in conflict. And so one of the ideas that was, I guess, spread and studied was the idea of Kant, that in order for the individual to do good, or to do what's right, or to do what's moral, he has to act against his animal side, his sense side. And this is the idea of duty, like of Kantian duty. And so, in order for us to, according to Kant's view and others like Kant, in order for us to achieve an improvement in the political state, mankind has to go against his nature. Now, Schiller rejects that idea. He has an idea he calls the beautiful soul. And in his view, yes, you have a rational side, yes, you have a sensual side, but the individual can transcend these and actually bring these two sides of himself into accord. Not that you really unite them, but that they act in parallel. They don't act in opposition. So that's we'll get back to that. I want to just say a couple of things about, just general things about European civilization and its development. Because it's not, there is a complexity to any individual or any civilization. There's complexity, but it's also something that can be understood. And there are two defining principles that exist probably in any civilization, but in European civilization you have a destructive force, which is an oligarchic principle. And you have a creative force, which is a Promethean principle. And the oligarchic principle is associated with the idea that human beings are animals. That there's really no fundamental distinction between man and animal. We're just, in fact, these figures like Kant and Rousseau and these guys, that's what they believe. That's why their view is that to act according to reason is unnatural, because you're going against your animal passions. The Promethean principle, it corresponds with the Christian ideal that man is made in the image of God. And what that effectively means is that we are the only species that has the power of creativity. And that power is expressed in our ability to know God's creation. That's what science is. And through science, we can actually take the forces of nature and we can will them as a power. And willing them as a power, we improve our existence. That's an economic principle. But it also is in line with the Christianity in its actuality. So this idea of the Promethean man, or the Christian idea of man in the image of God, this is actually fundamental to the development of the modern nation state. Because the idea of the common good, which was developed, again, around the time of the Renaissance, this was a revolutionary concept. There were predecessors, but it was consolidated by Cuso, who was one of the great figures of the German classical tradition. But he had a very radical notion that the monarch should actually serve the people. That he's a legitimate monarch if he serves the people and if he acts for the common good of the people. And so that was around the beginning of the 15th century. But that idea was crucial for what would become the American Constitution and the notion that the nation exists for the general welfare. So Schiller, his notion of political freedom and the reconciliation with individual freedom, it's tied to the Promethean idea and to the idea of statecraft, of the common good. And so these ideas are why we exist, despite the destructive nature of the oligarchic principle and this idea that we're just animals and that we're fundamentally no different than all the other species. Now, I'm going through this because creating the new paradigm, as we've defined it, it's not a matter of a logical argument with somebody, or it's not a matter of having it's not an issue of a rational agreement. These ideas, like the Promethean idea, the common good, the ideas of the classical tradition have been under attack. Especially during the 20th century, but even in Schiller's time. I mean, Schiller, his life was in danger for expressing these kinds of ideas. But one of I guess, after the Second World War, there was an explicit attack from an organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was it was, again, a post-war, how should I say this? It was an organization that had as a cover winning the cultural war against communism. And there was a lot of CIA involvement where what we think of as modern culture, modern art, modern music, was actually being actively promoted by oligarchic forces to actually destroy the classical tradition. And some of the figures that were involved in promoting this were people like Bertrand Russell, who was actually a very key figure for that whole period in trying to stop the progress and development of European civilization. Another figure is Theodor Adorno, the guy pictured at the bottom.
Adorno?
Adorno.
Excuse me, what was the first guy's name?
Bertrand Russell. Yeah. Adorno is responsible for much of modern music and the intention behind modern music. And he actually wrote a book with the name The Philosophy of Modern Music. And what he says is that the purpose of music, this is a paraphrase, is to induce a state of schizophrenia in people. Russell was actively promoting the development of psychological science to control people. I mean, he talks about this in lectures that he gave at UCLA, the impact of science in society. So what you had was this, for example, the CIA would throw money around to promote artistic movements, artistic displays, galleries, music performances. People like William de Kooning, the abstract expressionist artist, Jackson Pollock, a lot of their work was being promoted as an active intelligence operation. And the idea on the surface was, this is freedom. This is free expression. De Kooning is free because he can paint pictures of mutilated women, which you can't tell that's what that's supposed to be. Or Jackson Pollock is free because he just throws paint on a canvas, and this is free. The Soviet Union, they're not free because their art is rigid, but we are free. They promoted certain musicians like Shostakovich. They also promoted literary journals, like The Encounter was one of the literary journals they promoted, but they put money into other literary journals to promote certain kinds of philosophical views, largely existential. The overall outlook that was being promoted by the likes of this crowd was a culture of depravity, bestiality, irrationalism, and that has become a lot of the cultural outlook today, where creativity is viewed as something irrational. It's something you can't understand. I mean, who can understand any of this? But that's the image of creativity that was being promoted by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So this is significant because of the role of art. And the role that art actually plays. Because Schiller's ideas are necessary to actually address the condition that many of the people in the transatlantic system find themselves in. There is a severe state of degradation of the populations in the U.S. From people I've spoken to here, I would say Canada, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. In Europe, I mean, what is the actual cultural state of people? Think about the state of how many people are on drugs, whether it's prescription drugs, how many kids are smoking pot, how many people are addicted to heroin, or what's the physical state of existence for people. There's a certain physical degradation that exists. Our townships or cities are broken down. There are counties in the United States where life expectancies are going down. like in West Virginia, for example. What is the cognitive state of the populations of the West? Think about the labor force. What is the state of the labor force? I mean, do you think people are getting smarter than they were decades ago? I mean, I'm just throwing this out because I think that I can speak generally about these things, but people will begin thinking of examples from their own life of just the cultural collapse that's existed in the West. Now, the reason I bring up the CCF is because this is not an accident. It didn't just happen this way. Cultures are created. The spiritual collapse of people, because that's actually, this is my personal view, but I don't, the whole issue around drug use, sexual perversion, you know, all kinds of whatever people do with their free time. This is also part of a spiritual collapse. I mean, why would you actually do things that are destructive to yourself if you don't value your own life and the contribution you can make with your own life? So, this is a challenge to actually bring people into a higher elevated state. We actually have to deal with the fact that there's been a total breakdown, not just physically, but culturally, and mentally, and spiritually. And Schiller is going to be required to actually bring people up to that state where they can actually even imagine the new system that we want to bring into existence. Now, Schiller wrote, you know, many essays. He also wrote, again, this series of letters on the aesthetical education, which I think is crucial for actually addressing this cultural breakdown. And it does deal with the subject matter of ennobling the character of the individual. Now, what he says is that, yes, the human being has a sense faculty, which you might call the animal side. Yes, we have a rational faculty. But the rational faculty is not our humanity. Now, the individual, if he's going to be human, has to be whole. That means you've got to actually develop each of these faculties to their fullest. You can't, like today, I guess the popular notion is that, or at least today, is that some people are art people, some people are science people. Some people like mathematics, some people like music. You know, some people are touchy-feely, some people are logical and rational. Based on Schiller's idea, these people would be what he would call overly determined, and would not be, I'm not saying they're not human, but they're not achieving their human creative potential. I mean, I like the example of Einstein or Max Planck, because these are two of the leading scientific thinkers. Planck could have been a classical pianist, because that's one avenue he was going to pursue. He ended up becoming a physicist. Einstein was a very good violinist. I mean, he was a very, I mean, maybe not the greatest in the world, but he was very good with the violin. He was very musical. So, would you call him a science person or an art person? Schiller's idea is that each individual has to actually develop a new faculty to transcend these two seemingly opposing sides. And it's in the development of this new faculty, you bring into a line the rational and the sensual. And it's only when you do that that you achieve your humanity. And the means to do that is through beauty. Now, that's a general idea, and I'm not going to define it here. What I will say is that Schiller puts great value in the role of the artist in elevating the mind into a state of beauty. beauty as a condition, but also as an object. And the artist's role is very, very crucial to creating the conditions by which the individual can willfully become whole. That's the idea of the aesthetical education. It's a very big idea, but it's absolutely important if we're going to overcome the moral, cultural, physical collapse that we face in our part of the world. And that should also give more of a sense of why we have community courses, why we promote classical culture, poetry, literature, why we need to study the ideas that are in these great works. It's not enough just to know the economics or the policy or things of that nature. And you're not going to actually, we're not going to succeed in our revolution by having a nice logical argument. So that's actually what I want to go through. We're going to be looking at the aesthetical education of man in depth. Well, I'll leave that for Robbie, but I'll just leave it there. I don't know if there's time, if anybody has questions. Yes?
The idea, contentious idea in the U.S. Constitution about the pursuit of happiness, that was inspired by Schiller, was it not?
No.
Okay.
No. Leibniz.
Oh, sorry,
Declaration
right,
of
Leibniz,
Independence.
sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Not the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, but the pursuit of happiness, it was inspired by the Renaissance, though. By the Renaissance thinkers in Europe.
I can't talk about it. I don't know. I know what some of my associates say. My associates say Leibniz, and they've done a lot of work on it. And apparently it's tied to the notion that Leibniz develops of felicity. Like Leibniz has written essays on felicity. If I wanted to investigate it more, I would look there.
Do you think there is a connection
Between
beauty, pursuit of happiness, and this larger vision?
Well, Schiller's idea of beauty comes from this third faculty. He develops this idea of a play faculty. And that the play faculty is what actually allows for the reconciliation of the animal and the rational man. So his idea of beauty comes from that. But beauty is ambiguous because it's a condition, it's a state of being, but it's also something that it's also an object. So it's ambiguous. Happiness, you'd have to. I have not defined it Socratically, so I really can't relate the two. That would be a nice discussion to have. It might take 20, 30 minutes or an hour.
It was just rolling around as you were going through it. I kept thinking of it. It reminded me of the.
Maybe somebody else would have an idea.
Sure.
Yes.
Actually, I kind of think that American pursuit of happiness is more oligarchic type, survival of the fittest. They, their happiness is eat, drink, and get married because they listen to pop music, go somewhere for nice food, don't think about the rest of the world, and better you do, you're in different one group and the others in the other group, so it is not.
Well, that would be the contemporary reinterpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That wasn't the way it was meant originally.
Well, maybe.
Again, though, I don't really know a lot about the pursuit of happiness as an idea. However, I do have an idea about Benjamin Franklin. And I do have an idea about the tradition he comes out of. And I do know that he was deployed out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony by Cotton Mather. And that colony actually was the first crack at a republic. And so there was a moral foundation for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So I don't think that, and Franklin is responsible for putting that phrase in that document, in the Declaration. So I don't think that oligarchic idea reconciles with Franklin. That's what I would say.
I actually more think what society is now, not
No, yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. What you're saying, that's the reinvention of history
Yes.
that the contemporaries would do. So yeah, I agree with that. I think they
Yeah.
would think
It's
that.
not what it meant to be.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's why we have to give them an aesthetical education.
Right.
Because that's how the thing is, what happens to people is that if you actually go through Schiller's aesthetical letters, he actually develops an idea of how the mind develops and how ideas are crystallized in your mind. And he calls that a process of determination. And the more determined you are, one way to put it is that the more determined you are, the more stubborn you are. That's one way to think of it. So you'll have your fixed ideas. How do you actually loosen people up so they can drop those fixed ideas if those ideas are wrong? That happens. That just happens. People develop ideas that shape their world order that are invalid, and it blocks them from getting at the truth. So the aesthetical education is actually addressing that. Like, people walk around thinking happiness is getting drunk and having pleasure. Well, there's a problem. You're definitely not thinking about posterity if you're just thinking about what you can get in life. And I don't think that we fought a war. Again, I'm American, so we didn't fight the American Revolution just so people could get fat and happy. So, Bill.
Yeah, I don't think you can take that out of the context of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When I think of that, I think of it in a way of, it doesn't mean you're going to achieve happiness, but it means that you have a life and a liberty in order to pursue that happiness, or some state of happiness, which could be a state of beauty, or could be a state of higher enlightenment, or whatever you perceive that to be. But within the context of the time and the era, I don't think it's, in the contemporary sense where it's gone now, it's quite ugly. But, pursuit of happiness is quite superficial and reduced to it, what you have and what you own and, how much money you have, which is not what that idea was all about. So I always look at it in the whole context of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
I think the key word is the pursuit. There's not a final state. It's not a destination, but it's something that you can always be moving towards less imperfection. It's about development.
I think what we need to do is not restore the cognitive power, but to rediscover our cognitive power. That's already pre-existing. It has been part of human culture, the dignity of man. But Schiller discovered it, and he made it a big, he built on it. So we need to rediscover what we already had.
I agree. Yeah. I agree. Yes.
I'm actually a Buddhist, and I studied psychology, and not in depth. And what they say that it depends how human looks at his potentials. If they are looking to get power from above, then they're just going to sit and wait until something comes up. Be nice and don't do any bad things. But if you're looking for the power from within, then you're going to work on your own self and get enlightened according to Buddhism. And actually, the law of Buddhists kind of follows what is up on the board now. And until every human being develops in between, then we only can have a positive society. We are not going to have a positive society if we are just going to wait for somebody to come and help us.
Can I tell you something Schiller says? He says the only power that human beings have is the power of their will. So what's actually informing the power of your will? For those that never develop the rational aspect, and they're just going purely on their senses and their passion. Their passion is in response to their senses. People that suppress their senses and are just going by this rational faculty are not, they really don't actually have, they don't do anything with a potency. So his idea is that you want to actually make it such that you act with passion. With passion is a potency. But you want it such that your passion does not violate reason. That's his idea. So then you do things based on will, and the will has a potency through the passion in which you do things, but it's not in violation of God's law. Yes?
How would you describe today's paradigm?
What's that?
How would you describe today's paradigm?
Today's paradigm?
Yeah.
You mean the one we're living under?
But, well, yeah, plus, of course, North America is probably different than Africa, or some countries in Africa, I'm not sure.
Sure, yeah, but they are being affected, though.
Of course.
Sure. Well, today's paradigm is an oligarchic one. It's an expression of the one we're living under is an expression of the oligarchic principle. It does not actually recognize the creative powers of man. Yeah.
I just want to say that we're talking about this transatlantic culture. We're not necessarily referring to Chinese culture, or African culture, or, you know.
I'm assuming that's what you're asking about. Are you asking about the paradigm we want to create, or the one we're living under?
No, the one we live under.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I assumed you're talking about.
The one we live under is probably best described as the couch potato paradigm. Because we're underutilizing the capability we have.
Well, it produces couch potatoes, but anyway, Dr. Hussein?
Earlier in your talk, you talked about the individual freedom and political freedom.
Yeah.
I just want to understand why they are separate. To my mind, both freedoms are individual freedoms.
Why do you say political freedom is individual?
And that's what you said. Political freedom is, again, if the individual doesn't have the freedom to choose his political views, then he doesn't have freedom.
Well, I think the notion is that in the earlier stages of civilization, when you had the development of organized society and organized states, there was a lot of coercion.
Yes.
I think it's Charlemagne had to wage war against the heathens because they weren't just going to become Christian. So they had to lop a lot of heads off. And that's what they did in that time. As societies become more organized and we are able to develop more advanced ways of regenerating our existence, economically, as people have more time to develop their minds. We've moved towards a state where the idea is that, well, we don't need to really coerce people to obey the law. People should actually obey the law out of their own will because they understand that the laws are good. So it's like the idea is that we're moving towards that phase of civilization's development. And so you could say, well, people are more free. The individual is more free because they're not really being coerced. That's my initial response. is that there is this dichotomy that exists between the organization of the state and the individual freedom. I'm not saying whether that dichotomy is accurate, but I do use the example for the example of the idea of a libertarian who says that the government is taking away your freedom. Like every law is a restriction of your freedom. But the idea is that your freedom is you get to do what you want. So that dichotomy does exist in certain concepts. Is that dichotomy part of nature? I mean, I'm not going to say that yet. I would say no, if you think of nature as what's going to be in the future. I'm thinking in terms of what's becoming, not in terms of how things are or how they were. I don't know if that satisfies your question. For now, I don't think I satisfied it, but yeah.
In the context of coercion, that makes sense to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Being suspicious type, skeptical, whatever you call it, is it not possible that freedom itself, that is, freedom as an expression and as a word itself, can become the anchor of a new ideology, or it has already become the anchor of a new ideology?
I think, yeah.
Right,
I think so.
because it seems to me that the danger across the board is ideology itself. And of course, what is ideology?
What is ideology? Are you asking me?
I'm posing the question, yeah. Anybody else wants to think about it?
Well, no, I think what you're raising, for example, freedom, I think oftentimes is reduced to the notion of the individual, abstracted from civilization.
Yeah.
Because the thing about human beings are social. We have a social nature. We don't, like, the idea of Robinson Crusoe, that's fiction. We need other people to live. We depend on other people. And it's important when young people are raised that they recognize that as quickly as possible. So it's an abstraction, but it becomes that notion of freedom becomes the basis for certain ideologies.
There is the issue. I think there's a danger in the misuse of language, in the sense that there's free of this, free of that, free of whatever. But freedom itself becomes a virtual category around which stories can be told, or woven, whatever you want, integrated, and it becomes the anchor of, because really, if you look at ideology, it's essentially a set of stories of what became us. Now, the us, once upon a time in hunter-gatherer society, meant just everybody present, or everybody in the village. But after you got mass society, us could be huge numbers of people, or we, or them, or whatever. And so the question of who is we, white man, that old joke about the Lone Ranger in Toronto.
I know that one.
Who's we becomes a serious issue. So if we start to develop stories of us, as opposed to stories of them, and us are the good guys and them are always the problem, we begin to develop it. And the stories have a core, an anchor, a name. It could be Yahweh and the children of Israel. It could be Jesus and the church militant. It could be the prophet and the faithful. It could be the working class and the capitalist class. It could be, it's on and on and on. You can make a category and create a story of us, whoever us happens to be in that circumstance, without a clear understanding of what you're doing. That's the same thing with, it could be the same thing with freedom. It isn't necessarily, but it could be. But it could be the anchor of an ideology that has become so.
Well, I think that what we have to do is develop the capacity to dialogue.
Sorry?
We have to develop, I think what's important is that we develop the capacity to actually dialogue and hash out what it is we're actually talking about. That way we don't have to be worried about being stuck in some ideology or some fixed belief system.
But that's the whole thing, is to be careful about the use of words.
Well, no, I don't think we should be careful about the use of words. I think
No,
we should-
I'm saying
well,
in our own minds,
Sure, but I'm just saying that we should actually be free to use the words that we need to use to
Oh,
express what we
I
need to
agree,
express.
totally agree.
Because that's like
we
a,
attach them, is what I'm saying.
sure,
In our own minds, that's not necessarily the real words of the world. But
sure. But I mean, Schiller's concept of freedom is, in terms of individual freedom, is tied to the idea of realizing our humanity and our human nature. That's his idea. But then that's associated with the idea that human beings are a creative force in nature.
there's another question.
Well, this fellow here.
Ultimately, freedom can be a dangerous thing if it is seen in the wrong way. If it is, because you have no freedom to violate fundamental principles.
What's that? I couldn't hear what you were saying.
You don't have the freedom to violate fundamental principles, because then you have to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, but why
So
would
you don't have absolute freedom. The only freedom you have really
But that-
is to follow the principles and to apply them and to discover them. You don't have the freedom to exempt yourself from this process.